The cold wind swept through the decaying remains of the old slave cabins. A group of archaeologists, bundled against the chill, stood in the muddy remnants of what was once a thriving plantation in the deep south. Their boots sank into the wet earth as they carefully picked their way through the ruins, each step measured, deliberate. The site had been abandoned for decades, but the land still seemed alive with the memories of its past, a heavy presence lingering in the air, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. This was no ordinary excavation. The team had been called here for one simple reason: something had been found beneath the cabins, and it wasn't just any discovery. The ground had been uneven, the floorboards of the cabins cracked and warped with age. But as the team dug deeper, they had found something more, a set of hidden containers, buried under layers of dirt and rotting wood. At first, they thought it was simply another historical find, old tools, artifacts, or perhaps remnants of life from long ago. But as the team began to uncover the first container, something changed. There was a palpable tension in the air. They weren't just unearthing history, they were uncovering something that should have stayed buried. Something that had remained hidden for a reason. The first container was small, inconspicuous at first glance, but as it was pulled free from the earth, the surrounding air seemed to grow colder. A strange heaviness settled over the team. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Evelyn Marks, hesitated for a moment before carefully setting it down. There was a marked unease in her voice as she instructed her team to open it slowly. They had been warned not to get too excited, not to jump to conclusions. It could be nothing more than old, rusted trinkets. But something about the way the container had been buried, the careful, deliberate nature of it, set off a series of warning bells in the back of her mind. With bated breath, the team gathered around. A small, fragile object lay inside, covered in what appeared to be a layer of dust and time. As Dr. Marks lifted the object from the box, the rest of the team gathered closer, their curiosity piqued. What was it? A personal belonging? A relic of a past so long buried it had nearly been forgotten. But as the object was revealed, gasps echoed in the group. The object was not what they had expected. It was a strange amulet, unlike anything they had ever seen before. Its intricate design seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air around them thicken. The amulet's metal was tarnished with age, but its shape was unmistakably deliberate. A symbol, perhaps. A message? But from whom? The archaeologists exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. Dr. Marks felt an inexplicable unease, as though they had opened a door to something far older, and far darker, than any of them could have imagined. The object felt alive in her hands, as though it had been waiting to be discovered. She turned it over carefully, inspecting the engravings on its surface. They were unlike anything she had seen before, an unfamiliar script, interwoven with symbols she couldn't begin to decipher. Her hands trembled, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was something about the object that felt wrong. The moment stretched on, heavy with a silent tension that was hard to shake. The team, though trained to handle strange discoveries, seemed to be on edge. The wind picked up again, howling through the ruins, as if echoing the unease that had settled over the group. As they continued to study the amulet, the team grew increasingly aware of the significance of their find. This wasn't just an ordinary relic. The amulet felt ancient, its weight suggesting a deep, unspoken history. And yet, there was something about it that felt disturbingly modern, as if it had been placed there recently, rather than centuries ago. The longer they examined it, the more unsettled they became. It wasn't just the object that disturbed them, it was the context in which they had found it. Dr. Marks ordered the team to take extra precautions. She insisted they document the object immediately, making sure every detail was recorded before any further examination took place. But as they moved to take photos and make notes, they found themselves distracted. There was an overwhelming sense that they were being watched, though no one else was around. The quiet, unnerving silence of the plantation ground seemed to press in on them, and even the sound of the wind felt distant, muffled, as though the land itself was holding its breath. As the team moved to examine the other containers buried beneath the floorboards, the tension only grew. Each new discovery seemed to add weight to the mystery. Another amulet, this one even more intricately designed than the first. A bundle of old, brittle papers, covered in the same strange script as the first amulet. A strange, weathered figurine that seemed to radiate an eerie energy, its eyes hollow and dark. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered, but with each new object, a sense of foreboding began to take root. These weren't just relics, they were messages, warnings from the past. But what were they trying to say? Dr. Mark stood back for a moment, taking in the sight of the containers and the objects they had uncovered. Her mind raced. What had been hidden here, beneath the cabins, and why? Were these objects some sort of ritualistic offering? Or perhaps they had been placed there as a safeguard, meant to protect something from discovery? The questions multiplied, each one more pressing than the last. There was no easy answer, and every step forward seemed to pull them deeper into the mystery. The land beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unspoken energy, as if it were alive, waiting for them to uncover its secrets. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the plantation grounds, the team packed up for the day. But no one felt at ease. The discovery of the hidden containers was just the beginning. The real questions, the ones that would haunt them, had only just begun to surface. What had been buried beneath the cabins, and why? What connection did these objects have to the history of the plantation, to the lives of the enslaved people who had once worked the land? And more troubling still, what had they uncovered that should have remained hidden? As the last of the daylight faded and darkness began to swallow the ruins, one thought lingered in the minds of the archaeologists: some things, no matter how buried, were never meant to be found. The plantation was a shadow of its former self, a silent witness to centuries of history buried in the red clay soil. The land stretched out in front of them, a haunting mix of wild overgrowth and crumbling buildings. The old slave cabins, once bustling with activity, now stood like empty sentinels, their wooden frames sagging under the weight of time. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, had long since been abandoned, its windows shattered and doors hanging loosely on their hinges. Weeds had overrun the front steps, and the once manicured gardens were now a tangled mess of vines and brambles. The house stood on a hill, its silhouette dark against the setting sun, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers across the land. Dar. Evelyn Marks, the lead archaeologist, paused for a moment as she looked out over the plantation. She had visited many historical sites in her career, but there was something about this place that unsettled her. It wasn't just the condition of the buildings, or the pervasive sense of decay. It was the silence. In most of the plantation estates she had studied, there was a kind of echo of the past. The remnants of life, broken dishes, old furniture, and personal items, gave a sense of what had once been. But here, there was nothing. No trace of the people who had once lived and worked here, no remnants of the lives that had been shaped and destroyed on this land. It was as though the plantation had been erased from history, a place that no one wanted to remember. The history of the estate was one steeped in tragedy, a tale that stretched back to the early 1800s, when it had first been established by the wealthy Montgomery family. The plantation had been one of the largest in the region, its vast fields of cotton, tobacco, and rice a source of immense wealth. The Montgomerys were among the wealthiest families in the South, their fortune built on the labor of hundreds of enslaved men and women who worked the land. The estate had thrived for decades, its opulence the envy of surrounding plantations. But as the years wore on, the world around it began to change. The Civil War had ravaged the South, and the Montgomerys, like many other slaveholding families, had lost everything. The estate had been seized by the Union Army, its wealth and land stripped away. When the war ended, the Montgomery family had never recovered. Their wealth had evaporated, and the estate had slowly fallen into disrepair. The once grand mansion, once filled with the laughter of children and the rustle of silk gowns, had become a hollow shell. The fields, once cultivated by enslaved hands, had been abandoned, left to grow wild and untamed. For years, the plantation had been left to rot, a symbol of a forgotten past. But it wasn't just the collapse of the estate that made the place eerie. There were whispers in the nearby towns of strange happenings, things that couldn't be explained. Locals spoke in hushed tones of strange lights seen in the windows of the mansion late at night, of eerie sounds coming from the cabins after dark, of figures moving through the overgrown fields when no one was supposed to be there. These rumors, though dismissed as superstition by outsiders, were taken very seriously by those who lived nearby. Even now, the nearby residents were reluctant to venture near the plantation, preferring to let it rot in peace rather than stir up whatever dark forces might still linger there. The archaeologists had come to the plantation in search of history, but they had found much more than they bargained for. Dr. Marks had been skeptical at first, dismissing the rumors as little more than ghost stories. But as she began to dig into the history of the estate, she found something far darker than she had expected. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the plantation's past was far from ordinary. It was a place where darkness and light had always been at odds, where wealth had been built on suffering, and where secrets had been buried for generations. In the early days of the plantation, the Montgomerys had relied heavily on enslaved labor, bringing in men, women, and children from Africa and the Caribbean to work the fields. These slaves were subjected to the harshest conditions, working from dawn until dusk in the unforgiving heat of the southern sun. Many died from exhaustion, disease, and abuse, their bodies buried in unmarked graves scattered across the property. But despite their suffering, the enslaved people had maintained a rich cultural heritage, weaving together elements of African traditions with the religious and folk practices of the South. It was said that they had their own secret rituals, passed down from generation to generation, hidden from the prying eyes of their masters. The Montgomerys, ever the symbol of Southern aristocracy, had turned a blind eye to the practices of their slaves, dismissing them as primitive superstitions. But as the years passed, strange things began to happen on the plantation. Crops failed for no apparent reason, the mansion suffered from unexplained structural damage, and people began to talk about mysterious illnesses and deaths among the enslaved. There were rumors of voodoo and witchcraft, of dark rituals performed in the dead of night to ward off evil spirits or to protect the souls of the enslaved. Some said that the slaves had placed protective charms around the plantation, hidden beneath the floorboards and in the walls of the cabins, in order to shield themselves from the wrath of their masters. But whether these stories were true, no one knew. As the years wore on, the plantation became more and more isolated. The Montgomerys left, abandoning the estate in the aftermath of the Civil War, and no one had cared enough to rebuild. The land was left to lie fallow, the once bustling estate falling into ruin. Yet, despite its dilapidation, the plantation never truly disappeared. It remained in the local memory, a place whispered about in the same breath as the haunted woods or the cursed river. And for years, it had sat quietly, waiting to be forgotten. But it was clear now that the past had not been content to remain buried. Dr. Marks and her team had come to the plantation with the hope of uncovering relics of the past, of understanding the lives of those who had lived and worked here. They had not expected to unearth so much more, a history steeped in pain and superstition, in hidden rituals and buried truths. As they dug deeper into the site, they began to uncover signs that suggested the enslaved had left something behind, something more than just memories. They had left behind objects, carefully concealed beneath the cabins, relics of their beliefs, their fears, and their hopes. It was becoming clear that this plantation, this forgotten corner of history, held secrets that had been locked away for far too long. And as the wind howled through the cracked windows of the mansion, Dr. Marks couldn't shake the feeling that these secrets were about to be revealed, whether anyone was ready for them or not. As the team continued their excavation on the plantation grounds, the first signs of something unusual began to surface, but they were subtle at first, barely perceptible. On the surface, everything seemed like just another typical archaeological dig. The tools were standard, the methodology sound, and the site itself appeared to be little more than an overgrown ruin, ripe for excavation. Yet as the team delved deeper into the cabins and began their careful excavation beneath the floorboards, things began to take on a decidedly unsettling tone. Dr. Marks had been cautious at first. After all, they were working in an area with a heavy historical presence, where the past was a dense, tangled web of real, lived experiences. But there were moments, fleeting instances, when the land seemed to respond to their presence. The air would grow heavy, thick with a sense of something just beyond their reach, something forgotten, buried, but unmistakably there. These early anomalies weren't earth-shattering at first, just small disturbances that caused a creeping sense of unease among the team. The cracks in the floorboards, the strange depressions in the ground, things that could easily be dismissed as mere weathering or natural shifts over time. But then came the first truly peculiar find. It was a patch of the floor that, when touched, seemed almost different. The earth was firmer in one spot, as though it had been compacted in a way that was inconsistent with the surrounding dirt. They had been digging for hours when one of the junior archaeologists, a young man named Lucas, noticed the anomaly. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a result of the shadows cast by the half-standing walls. But as he knelt down to inspect the area more closely, he realized that something was off. There was a subtle resistance to his shovel as it cut through the soil, a resistance that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the typical soft, loamy texture of the earth around them. This spot was different, hardened and dense. As he carefully dug around the edges of the spot, Lucas's shovel struck something solid, something that didn't belong in the ground at all. His heart skipped a beat as the metal clinked, the sound reverberating through the silent ruins of the cabin. He called Dr. Marks over, and soon the rest of the team gathered around to inspect what was unearthed. It was a box, old, rusted, and heavily decayed, but clearly not something that should have been there. Dr. Marks knelt down, her hand trembling as she brushed the dirt away. The box was sealed shut, its edges caked with years of grime and decay. But there was something about it that felt deliberate. Something about the way it had been buried, the way it had been hidden under layers of dirt, that didn't sit right with her. The box was too old to be a modern artifact, but it wasn't a relic either. It was a curious mix of age and preservation, as though it had been purposefully sealed away, protected from the elements. The team managed to carefully open it, and inside they found more objects, an amulet, much like the ones they had already discovered, but this one was larger, its design more intricate, more ominous. It was made of a dark, weathered metal, and the patterns carved into its surface were so complex they seemed to defy explanation. The team spent hours examining it, but no one could make sense of the symbols. They were unlike anything they had ever seen before, not from any known culture or language. The amulet seemed to hum with a strange energy, an almost imperceptible vibration that resonated deep in the bones of those who held it. There was an unease in the air, a prickling sensation that seemed to grow stronger the longer they examined the artifact. But it was only the beginning. As they continued to dig, more and more containers began to surface, each one more unsettling than the last. The discovery of these objects, buried beneath the cabins, seemed to stir something in the land itself. The very air around them seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up suddenly, as if in response to the team's intrusion. The surrounding trees, which had been still just moments before, swayed in a way that felt unnatural, their limbs creaking in the wind. A shadow passed over the team, casting a fleeting darkness over the sight. It was a passing cloud, but it felt more like something else, something watching. Then came the strange noises. At first, they thought it was simply the wind, rustling through the branches above them. But as the hours passed and they continued to work, the sounds grew clearer, more distinct. Low murmurs, voices that seemed to rise from the earth itself, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. The team had grown accustomed to the creaks and groans of the old buildings, but these noises were different. These weren't the sounds of decay. These were the sounds of something alive, something moving in the distance, but not quite visible. At first, no one said anything, unwilling to admit what they were all feeling. But as the days passed, the sounds grew more frequent, and the unease became harder to ignore. One evening, just as the team was preparing to leave for the day, the noises grew louder. Dr. Marks stood at the edge of the cabin, gazing out over the land. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the plantation had taken on a darker, more oppressive feel. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying wood. And then, as if responding to her thoughts, the noises came again. This time, they were unmistakable, voices. Low, guttural, indistinguishable, and speaking in a language that none of them recognized. Dr. Marks froze, her heart racing. She turned to the team, but none of them had spoken. No one had moved. They were all frozen, listening to the sounds coming from the woods surrounding them, just beyond the cabin. The wind, which had been howling minutes earlier, fell silent. Even the usual rustling of the trees had stopped. There was nothing now but the strange murmurs that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had come to a standstill. The only sound was the pulsing murmur, a strange, rhythmic sound, like chanting. It felt like something ancient, something that had been buried deep within the earth for centuries, now waking up to be heard. The next morning, as the team resumed their work, the unease continued to grow. The ground beneath the cabin seemed to resist their tools, as though it was trying to keep its secrets buried. Every excavation became more difficult, every object found felt like it was deliberately hidden from view. But despite the growing sense of dread, they pressed on, determined to uncover the truth about what had been left behind. What began as small anomalies, strange sounds, unusual objects, the occasional unsettling feeling, quickly transformed into a full-scale mystery. The land, it seemed, had its own stories to tell. And they were stories of pain, secrecy, and something far darker than any of them had anticipated. Something that had been buried so deeply, so carefully concealed, that it had resisted discovery for generations. And now, it was being unearthed, not by chance, but because it had been waiting to be found. The team was too far gone now. The truth was there, just beneath the surface, and as they dug deeper, they knew they were crossing a line, one that, once crossed, could never be undone. The whispers had started, and there would be no turning back. As the days stretched on, the archaeologists began to notice something troubling. It wasn't just the land that seemed to carry a weight, but the people surrounding it. The locals, those few who still remained in the nearby town, were not eager to discuss the plantation or its history. In fact, most of them avoided the topic altogether, as though acknowledging the past would somehow awaken something better left undisturbed. Dr. Marks, driven by a need for context, began reaching out to locals who might have known something, anyone who could shed light on the area's history, or perhaps provide some insight into the strange occurrences they had witnessed. The first of these witnesses was an elderly man named Earl Thompson. He had grown up in the area, his family having lived on the outskirts of the plantation for generations. He was a quiet man, his deep-set eyes weary from years of living close to the land, and when Dr. Marks approached him about the plantation, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply stared at the ground, his gnarled hands clasped tightly in his lap. There was a long pause before he finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "You don't want to know about that place," he said, his tone firm, as though the words themselves had weight. "No good comes from messing with what's buried there." Dr. Marks tried to keep her voice gentle. "But we're not here to disturb anything, Earl. We're just trying to understand what happened. What was it like, back then? What do you remember?" Earl shook his head, his gaze flickering toward the distant silhouette of the plantation house. "People talk about it, sure. But they don't talk to outsiders. They've seen things they don't talk about, not to anyone. You ask the wrong person, and you'll get more than you bargained for." He hesitated for a moment, as though wrestling with some invisible force. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "It wasn't always like this. The land was good once, rich with life. But after the war, after the Montgomerys left, things started to change. That's when the stories started. And once the stories started, there was no going back." Earl didn't elaborate further, but his words lingered in the air like an unsaid warning. Dr. Marks pressed on, urging him to continue, but he wouldn't. Instead, he muttered something about his father having seen things, strange lights in the windows, figures walking in the fields at night. Things that didn't make sense. Things that weren't human. As she left Earl's house that day, Dr. Marks couldn't shake the feeling that something had been withheld from her, that there was more to the story than Earl was willing to reveal. She returned to the plantation site with the growing suspicion that the land had more to say than the people who lived near it. The next witness was a woman named Marguerite, a descendant of slaves who had once worked on the plantation. She was younger than Earl, but her features were hardened by years of hardship and the weight of her family's history. When Dr. Marks approached her with the same questions, she responded differently. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no fear of speaking the truth. "Everyone around here knows better than to go near that place," Marguerite said bluntly. "It's cursed. My grandmother used to tell me stories, stories of things they saw, things they heard. People who worked there, they were never the same once they left. They'd come into town, but they'd never stay long. Something followed them." Dr. Marks was taken aback. "Something followed them? What do you mean?" Marguerite's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's like the land itself was hungry, waiting for them to come back. And when they didn't, it started taking from them. It was subtle at first. People would hear things. Strange sounds. Whispers in the night. But it wasn't the kind of thing you could talk about. You'd sound crazy. So they kept it quiet. But then people started disappearing. Not many. Just a few here and there. But when you live in a place like this, you notice when someone's gone." Dr. Marks pressed further, but Marguerite's face hardened, and she would say no more. Instead, she gave Dr. Marks a final warning. "Don't go digging any deeper. There are things in that soil that no one should ever disturb. The land wants to keep its secrets. And it won't let them go easily." Despite the warnings, Dr. Marks continued her work. But as she did, the stories from the locals started to change. No longer were they just whispers of strange noises or flickering lights, the stories grew darker, more visceral. One night, an old woman who lived in a small house at the edge of the town came to Dr. Marks. She had heard about the excavation and seemed compelled to speak. Her name was Ruth, and she had lived in the town all her life, though she hadn't set foot near the plantation in decades. When Dr. Marks sat down with her, Ruth wasted no time. "You think the ghosts are the worst of it?" "It's not the ghosts," Ruth said, her voice trembling as she leaned in close. "It's the shadows. The ones you can't see. They follow you home. They don't want you to know the truth. They don't want anyone to remember what happened." Dr. Marks felt a chill run through her as Ruth's words sank in. The old woman spoke of shadows that crept into the corners of homes, of things that moved just outside the edge of sight, always just out of reach. She spoke of her own family, who had once worked in the fields, and how they'd warned her never to venture near the plantation grounds. They said the land had been cursed long before the war. It wasn't just the spirits of the dead that haunted it. There was something else, something far darker, a presence that lingered in the soil, in the bones of the cabins, in the remnants of the plantation house itself. Ruth described how, after the war, many of the slaves had sought to escape, but some had come back, drawn to the land by something they couldn't understand. Some said they came back for vengeance. Others said it was a need to bury something, to tie up loose ends. But in the end, none of them stayed for long. They left the town and never returned. And then Ruth spoke of the most terrifying thing of all. There were people, she said softly, who tried to make peace with whatever it was on that land. They tried to offer it something, appease it, but it didn't want offerings. It wanted silence. It wanted obedience. Dr. Marks, sensing that she was treading too close to something that could unravel everything, tried to end the conversation. But Ruth's words lingered, echoing in her mind long after she left the old woman's house. The closer Dr. Marks got to the heart of the plantation's mystery, the more she realized that what had been buried was not just historical, it was something alive, something that refused to be forgotten. As the team continued their work, the whispers of the past grew louder. And the more they dug, the more they realized that what they were uncovering was not simply a collection of ancient objects or forgotten artifacts. The land had a story to tell, but it wasn't a story anyone wanted to hear. And as the team moved closer to the truth, the shadows that had haunted the plantation for generations began to stir once more. As the days passed, the unease surrounding the excavation grew, but the tension wasn't just limited to the team or the locals. It became clear that there were forces at work far beyond the plantation grounds themselves. The more the archaeologists uncovered, the more resistance they encountered from the outside world. What had begun as an innocent academic pursuit quickly began to attract unwanted attention. The excavation, it seemed, was not just uncovering relics of the past but was disturbing something that people preferred to leave buried, not just physically, but ideologically. It was becoming evident that the land had a history people didn't want to remember, and the answers being unearthed might be far too dangerous for society to confront. Dr. Marks, though initially undeterred, soon found herself facing the subtle but unmistakable pushback from the local community. At first, it was nothing more than quiet mutterings and concerned looks exchanged between townspeople as they walked by the team. But then, things began to escalate. One afternoon, as Dr. Marks and her team were digging deeper beneath one of the cabins, a group of local churchgoers appeared on the site, standing silently at the edge of the clearing, watching them. They were dressed in their Sunday best, their faces serious, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disdain. They didn't speak at first, but their presence alone made it clear they didn't approve of what the archaeologists were doing. The group was led by Reverend Charles Dunlap, the local minister, a man whose presence was as commanding as it was intimidating. His reputation in the town was built on his unwavering belief that the area's long history of slavery and suffering had cursed the land. According to him, the wrongs committed by the Montgomery family and the dark rituals allegedly practiced by the enslaved had left the land irreparably tainted. His sermons, filled with fire and brimstone, had warned the town for years about the dangers of trying to uncover the past. "Some things are best left to God," he would often say. "There's power in the past, and it is not always a good power. There are forces we are not meant to understand." Dr. Marks, who had prided herself on her rational approach to history and archaeology, found herself at odds with Dunlap from the very beginning. She had always believed that history, no matter how dark or painful, should be uncovered. But as Dunlap and his followers began to approach her and her team, she felt the first stirrings of doubt. The minister was an imposing figure, his eyes narrow with suspicion, his every word heavy with conviction. "Dr. Marks," Reverend Dunlap began, his voice smooth but firm, "I know you believe you are doing the right thing, but some things are better left buried. The land you're digging into is cursed. It carries the weight of hundreds of souls, lost to time but not to history. And some history is best forgotten." His words struck Dr. Marks like a hammer blow. She had heard of such sentiments before, the reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, the tendency to bury painful history, but hearing it from someone who had such deep influence in the town made it feel far more real. She tried to remain polite, explaining that their work was academic, that they weren't trying to disturb anything, just uncover the past to better understand it. But Dunlap wasn't interested in explanations. His eyes burned with an intensity that made her uneasy. "The past is not meant to be understood," he said, his voice growing more forceful. "What happened on that plantation is a stain upon our community. And it is not our place to dig it up. You think you are uncovering history, but you are unearthing a curse. You do not know what you are meddling with." Dr. Marks didn't know how to respond to such a statement. The calm, logical explanations that had worked in academic circles seemed useless here. What could she say to someone who believed so firmly in the supernatural, in the power of unseen forces? It became clear that Dunlap wasn't merely concerned about the land being disturbed, he was terrified of what might happen if the secrets of the past were brought into the light. As the days passed, Dunlap's campaign against the excavation intensified. He spread word to the local community, urging them to join him in opposing the dig. Soon, people who had once been curious about the project or at least indifferent to it were now actively avoiding the archaeologists. The town's businesses, once willing to provide supplies and support, began to turn their backs. The local inn, where the team had been staying, informed them they could no longer accommodate them. Even the few farmers who had agreed to sell them food began to withdraw their support. The town itself was becoming a ghost of its former self, and Dr. Marks began to wonder whether it was more than just the excavation causing the rift. Was something else at play here, something darker than she could understand? It wasn't just the locals who started to voice their opposition, but local authorities, too. One afternoon, as Dr. Marks was reviewing some of the newly uncovered artifacts with her team, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the site. His presence, though polite, was unmistakably official. He didn't offer any real explanation for his visit, only stating that they had received a complaint from local residents about the excavation. The complaints, he explained, had grown to the point where they could no longer ignore the matter. The deputy's message was clear: either cease the excavation or face legal consequences. The idea that their work might be forcibly halted seemed almost surreal to Dr. Marks. For years, she had navigated bureaucratic red tape and fought for funding in academic circles, but the idea of being stopped in her tracks by something as mundane as a town ordinance seemed almost laughable. Yet the sheriff's deputy's words weren't to be taken lightly. They represented a real, institutional threat, a force that wasn't interested in the historical significance of their work, but only in preserving the status quo. Despite the mounting pressure, Dr. Marks and her team refused to stop. Their conviction was clear: the past could not remain hidden forever. But the interference continued. One by one, they were confronted by more individuals from the town, many of whom had no interest in history or archaeology, but simply wanted to protect the community from what they saw as an intrusion into a painful past. In the weeks that followed, the situation reached a breaking point. Reverend Dunlap's sermons grew more intense, urging the townspeople to rise up against what he called the blasphemy of the excavation. He began to speak of the land as though it were a living entity, as though it had a will of its own. The Montgomery family's sins, he claimed, had seeped into the very soil, and any attempt to uncover them would be met with dire consequences. He preached of the land's curse, warning that even the most well-intentioned efforts would result in suffering. As the pressure mounted, Dr. Marks and her team began to feel the weight of the town's disapproval. The work, which had once been a source of pride and excitement, had begun to feel like an oppressive task. What had they stumbled upon? Was it just a matter of history, or was there something deeper at play here? Something more dangerous. The religious fervor surrounding the project made it impossible to ignore the tension in the air. People were not just afraid of the past, they feared the very act of confronting it. The veil of silence that had surrounded the plantation for generations was something they were unwilling to lift, no matter the cost. It became clear that what they were up against wasn't just superstition or fear, but a deeply ingrained belief that some things were better left undisturbed. And as the team continued their work, they began to question whether they were truly prepared for what they might uncover, or whether, in their pursuit of knowledge, they were unwittingly challenging forces far beyond their understanding. The land wanted to keep its secrets, and the more they dug, the more they realized, some things, once brought to the surface, could never be put back. As the excavation continued, the psychological toll on Dr. Marks and her team became increasingly evident. What had begun as an intellectual pursuit, an academic exercise to uncover the past, was beginning to unravel the minds of those involved. It wasn't just the unrelenting pressure from the townspeople or the growing tension between logic and superstition that weighed on them. It was the sense that something was wrong, something intangible and sinister, that gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. The deeper they dug into the history of the plantation, the more they felt as though they were digging into their own minds, revealing fears and insecurities they hadn't known existed. For Dr. Marks, the strain was perhaps the most intense. She had always prided herself on her rationality, her ability to separate emotion from the pursuit of knowledge. But as the days passed, her resolve began to crack. It wasn't just the strange findings, the artifacts that seemed to pulse with energy, the mysterious objects buried beneath the cabins. It was the feeling that something was watching them, something that was very much alive and aware of their presence. The land seemed to have its own consciousness, a dark, quiet intelligence that was observing their every move. And with that realization came the creeping suspicion that they had crossed some line that should never have been crossed. It wasn't just Dr. Marks who felt this way. The entire team was affected. Lucas, the young archaeologist who had been so eager to uncover the secrets of the plantation, began to withdraw. At first, his behavior was subtle. He became quieter, less engaged with the work, his thoughts often drifting to places no one could follow. He had been the one to first uncover the hidden box beneath the floorboards, and since that moment, it seemed as though something inside him had changed. His eyes would dart nervously when he thought no one was looking, and his hands trembled slightly when he handled the artifacts. He had once been fascinated by the idea of unraveling history, but now the past seemed to haunt him, as though it were a living entity that would not let him go. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of excavation, Lucas approached Dr. Marks as she was packing up her things. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he were afraid to speak too loudly. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something here, something wrong. I feel like I'm being followed. It's like the land is alive, like it's waiting for something." Dr. Marks was taken aback. She had known that Lucas had been struggling with the growing unease around the site, but she hadn't expected him to reach this breaking point. She tried to reassure him, to remind him that it was just the pressure of the excavation, that the psychological strain of working in such an isolated, charged environment was taking its toll on everyone. But Lucas wasn't convinced. He had seen something that had shaken him to his core, and no amount of reasoning could calm him. The next day, Lucas didn't show up for the dig. When Dr. Marks went to his tent to check on him, she found it empty. His belongings were still there, his journal, his field notes, even his favorite jacket, but Lucas was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of where he had gone or why. It was as though he had simply vanished. No one had heard from him since. The disappearance of Lucas sent shockwaves through the team. Dr. Marks tried to remain calm, but the growing unease that had been gnawing at her for weeks suddenly took on a sharper, more urgent edge. The town was already on edge, and now this, a member of her team had disappeared without a trace. The police were called, but their investigation turned up nothing. There were no leads, no signs of foul play. The town, which had already been skeptical of the excavation, now seemed to distance itself even further. People were too afraid to talk, too afraid to speculate. Even the sheriff, who had been sympathetic to the team's work in the past, was suddenly hesitant, his responses short and unhelpful. The next few days were a blur of worry and confusion. Dr. Marks tried to keep the team focused on their work, but the absence of Lucas weighed heavily on everyone. The unease had spread, like a disease, infecting even the most rational minds. The team began to argue, their patience wearing thin. Small irritations became full-blown conflicts. A minor disagreement over the excavation techniques escalated into a shouting match between two of the senior archaeologists. It was as though the very fabric of the team was unraveling, and Dr. Marks wasn't sure how much longer they could continue without falling apart completely. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Dr. Marks was working alone in the main cabin. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the land, and the air had grown colder, the wind picking up in the distance. As she sifted through her notes, trying to make sense of the strange symbols they had uncovered, she heard something, a faint sound, like a whisper on the wind. At first, she thought it was just the wind itself, rustling through the trees. But then it came again, clearer this time, a low murmur, like a chant. She stood up, her heart racing, and walked toward the door. The sound was coming from the direction of the woods, no, not from the woods, but from the plantation house itself. The windows, which had once been shattered, now seemed to glow faintly, as though lit from within. She stared, transfixed, as the eerie chanting grew louder, the words impossible to understand but undeniably unsettling. It was as though the house itself was calling to her, beckoning her to come closer. Dr. Marks shook herself out of her stupor and rushed to the site where the team had been working. But when she arrived, she found that no one else was there. The tents were empty. The excavation tools lay abandoned in the dirt. It was as though everyone had simply left, as though they had vanished without a trace, just as Lucas had. Panic set in. Dr. Marks called out for her team, her voice trembling, but there was no response. The wind howled, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out as if trying to envelop her. She turned back toward the plantation house, her feet moving of their own accord, as though something was guiding her, pulling her forward. When she reached the mansion, the door creaked open of its own accord. The chanting had stopped, but the air was thick with a sense of malevolence, as though the house itself had been waiting for her. She stepped inside, and immediately, she felt the oppressive weight of the place descend upon her. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and the faint smell of decay filled the air. The house was no longer just a building, it was a presence, a living entity that seemed to breathe with her, to watch her every move. She called out again, but her voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. The house seemed to respond to her fear, as though it was feeding off her anxiety. And then, in the far corner of the room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, in the shadows, were the figures of her team. They stood perfectly still, their eyes wide, their faces pale and blank, staring at her with an intensity that was almost unnatural. But as she approached, they didn't move. They didn't speak. It was as though they were no longer truly human, no longer truly alive. They were empty shells, their bodies inhabited by something far darker. Dr. Marks took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. She had crossed a line. And now there was no turning back. In the wake of the unsettling events at the plantation, Dr. Marks found herself at a crossroads. The disappearance of Lucas, the strange and increasingly vivid manifestations that plagued her team, and the mounting resistance from the locals had placed the project in jeopardy. Yet, despite the growing unease, she remained resolute in her mission. For her, the pursuit of truth, the unearthing of history, was a sacred duty, one that could not be abandoned simply because of fear or superstition. But as the team continued to grapple with the inexplicable, Dr. Marks felt an overwhelming need to seek out rational explanations, to find a way to make sense of the chaos that had consumed their lives. The first step in this process was to reach out to experts. She had always believed that the scientific method, logic, reason, evidence, would guide them to the truth, no matter how dark or uncomfortable that truth might be. She contacted colleagues in anthropology, archaeology, and even psychology, hoping to find answers that could explain the strange occurrences they had witnessed. Each expert offered their own perspective, their own theories, but the more they discussed, the more it became clear that they were struggling to fit the pieces of this puzzle into a coherent framework. Nothing seemed to quite fit. One of the first experts Dr. Marks consulted was Dr. Eleanor Hughes, a renowned anthropologist who specialized in the study of folklore and ritualistic practices. Dr. Hughes had worked on numerous excavations involving cultures with deeply ingrained spiritual beliefs, and Dr. Marks hoped that she might provide some insight into the objects they had uncovered, particularly the amulets and symbols that seemed to defy explanation. After examining the artifacts and hearing the details of the excavation, Dr. Hughes had one simple, though chilling, response: "This isn't just an archaeological site. What you have here is a shrine, an altar of some kind. What you're digging into is not just history, it's a place of ritual." Her words sent a shiver down Dr. Marks's spine. Ritualistic sites were not uncommon in archaeology. Temples, burial grounds, and sacred spaces had been discovered all over the world. But this was different. The items they had found, the amulets, the strange symbols, the boxes hidden beneath the cabins, were not typical relics. They spoke of something darker, something less tangible, something that seemed to transcend the boundaries of time and culture. Dr. Hughes speculated that the plantation might have been the site of an ancient belief system, one that had been practiced by the enslaved people who had worked there. It wasn't unusual for enslaved people to retain elements of their African heritage, particularly their spiritual practices, even when living under brutal conditions. However, there was something unusual about this site, something that made it stand apart from other known rituals. The intensity of the symbolism, Dr. Hughes explained, the object's design, and the manner in which they were hidden. This was not an ordinary form of worship or superstition. This was something more powerful, more dangerous. Yet, for all her expertise, Dr. Hughes had no answers. She couldn't explain why the artifacts seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, nor could she explain the strange sense of presence that seemed to permeate the land. She speculated that the site could have been a place of religious resistance, a location where rituals were performed to either protect the enslaved or to exact vengeance on their captors. But Dr. Marks felt that this explanation, though compelling, didn't fully account for the growing dread that surrounded the excavation. Dr. Marks sought out another expert, this time a psychologist named Dr. Simon Keller, who had studied the effects of trauma and superstition on communities. Dr. Keller's expertise lay in the ways in which individuals and societies processed collective suffering, how deeply ingrained trauma could manifest in strange and irrational ways. Given the horrors of slavery and the unresolved wounds of the plantation, Dr. Marks hoped that Dr. Keller might provide some perspective on the mental and emotional toll the excavation was taking on her team. At first, Dr. Keller seemed open to the idea that the team's reactions could be explained by psychological factors. He suggested that the environment itself, the isolation, the constant exposure to the dark history of the plantation, and the immense pressure to uncover something profound, could be causing the team members to project their fears onto the site. The mind, Dr. Keller explained, was capable of creating perceptions of danger and menace in response to stress, particularly when individuals were working in a place imbued with such deep, unresolved suffering. The mind can play tricks, he said. It's not unusual for people working in places with a heavy emotional history to experience heightened sensations, sounds, shadows, feelings of being watched. These are psychological responses to the trauma embedded in the land itself. The mind is processing that trauma, and it's manifesting in strange ways. But Dr. Keller's theories didn't satisfy Dr. Marks. While she understood the concept of psychological projection, something about the events surrounding the plantation seemed to defy simple explanation. The feelings of being watched, the coldness in the air, the strange noises, these weren't just figments of the team's imagination. There was something more at work. Something that couldn't be explained away by stress or fear. The breakthrough came when Dr. Marks consulted with a geologist, Dr. Richard Abernathy, who had experience in studying the effects of the land itself on human perception. Dr. Abernathy's field of expertise was less conventional but nonetheless crucial. He was known for his research into the electromagnetic properties of certain geological formations and their potential to influence the human brain. He had worked on several projects where geological anomalies were linked to heightened psychological states, particularly in areas with unusual energy fields. When Dr. Abernathy reviewed the data from the site, he suggested that the plantation might be located on top of a unique geological feature, a convergence of underground minerals and water sources that could produce electromagnetic fields strong enough to affect the brain. What you're describing sounds like the effects of a strong geomagnetic anomaly, he explained. There are certain areas on Earth where the natural electromagnetic fields interact with the human brain in ways that can cause hallucinations, feelings of unease, and even paranoia. Dr. Abernathy's theory seemed plausible. If there was indeed a geomagnetic anomaly beneath the plantation, it could explain the heightened sense of dread that permeated the site. It could account for the strange sensations of being watched, the whispers, and the disturbing visions. But as Dr. Marks thought about it more, she realized that this theory only accounted for part of the mystery. Even if the land's physical properties were influencing the team's perceptions, there was still something far more ancient and deeply unsettling at play. The more she thought about the artifacts they had uncovered, the more she began to question whether there was a rational explanation at all. Could this really be just a case of psychological stress and geomagnetic interference? Or was there something far more profound at work, something that transcended science and reason? With these conflicting theories swirling in her mind, Dr. Marks found herself at a crossroads. Each explanation seemed to offer a piece of the puzzle, but none of them could account for the totality of the experiences they had been having. The scientific theories, though well-founded in their own right, seemed to miss the point. They were too narrow, too focused on the physical and psychological, and not on the metaphysical, on the power that the land itself seemed to hold over them. The search for an explanation, it seemed, would not be as simple as applying scientific theories or psychological reasoning. No matter how many experts she consulted, Dr. Marks was beginning to realize that the answers they sought might lie outside the realm of logic and reason altogether. The plantation had its secrets, and those secrets were not going to be easily unlocked. As the days wore on, the tension that had been slowly building among the team reached a breaking point. What had once been a promising archaeological excavation had become a slow descent into chaos. The psychological toll of the excavation, combined with the mounting resistance from the local community and the increasingly strange phenomena surrounding the site, had created an atmosphere of unease that no one could escape. Dr. Marks found herself waking up every morning with a sense of dread, her mind clouded by the feeling that something terrible was looming just out of sight. But it wasn't just the fear of the unknown that was affecting her now. It was the sense of isolation, the overwhelming realization that they were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a place where logic and reason no longer held sway. The team had tried to continue working, but the atmosphere on the site had become unbearable. The locals, who had once been curious or indifferent to the excavation, had become increasingly hostile, their presence more and more oppressive. It wasn't just the religious protests or the authorities' interference that caused the tension. It was the fact that the land itself seemed to be pushing them away, as though it was rejecting them, repelling them with an invisible force that only grew stronger the longer they stayed. Dr. Marks knew something had changed, something had shifted. The ground they were digging into no longer felt like a simple archaeological site. It felt like a living, breathing entity, one that was aware of their presence, one that had begun to fight back. But it wasn't just the land that was hostile. It was the very fabric of reality itself. Time seemed to bend and warp. Days passed in strange, indistinct lumps. They had lost track of how long they had been at the plantation, the hours blending into one another, each day indistinguishable from the next. The once crisp divide between day and night had blurred, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. The team's breakdowns became more frequent. The members who had once worked tirelessly now moved sluggishly, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep and the constant dread that gnawed at their minds. Even the most resolute members of the team, the ones who had been firm in their belief that this was simply an archaeological project, began to question their purpose here. The artifacts, the strange symbols, and the overwhelming sense of being watched had taken their toll. They were no longer just digging into the past, they were digging into something that seemed to resist being uncovered, something that didn't want to be found. It was during this period of overwhelming fatigue and mounting fear that things began to unravel completely. One night, after another long and fruitless day of excavation, Dr. Marks sat alone in the main cabin, staring at her field notes. The silence around her was oppressive, heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the branches creaking and groaning like the sound of an ancient creature waking from its slumber. She had become accustomed to the strange noises, the whispers in the wind, the low hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, but tonight, it was different. There was something more distinct, more tangible about it. It was as if the air itself was alive, vibrating with a strange energy that she could almost feel in her bones. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. She stood up, her heart racing, and moved toward the door. Her first thought was that it was one of the team members, perhaps Lucas, who had been missing for days. But as she opened the door, she was met by nothing but darkness. The land stretched out before her, empty and still, as though nothing had moved for centuries. She stepped outside, calling out into the void, but there was no answer. The wind, which had been howling moments before, had suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The unsettling silence stretched on until she heard something, a faint sound, like the rustle of movement just beyond her reach. It was too faint to make out, too subtle to pinpoint, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. She stepped back into the cabin, locking the door behind her. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had heard. It could have been an animal, a deer or some other creature in the woods. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It wasn't the land itself that was unnerving her, it was the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was waiting for her to make a mistake. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, crawling along her skin like 1,000 tiny ants. The unease settled into the very core of her being, and for the first time in weeks, she felt as though she was truly alone, not just physically, but existentially. The excavation, which had once felt like a journey of discovery, now seemed like an endless march into a void, a place where nothing would be found except more questions, more mysteries, and no answers. Dr. Marks tried to focus on the task at hand, but the longer she stayed, the more disconnected she felt from reality. It was as though the world outside the plantation had ceased to exist. She hadn't spoken to anyone from the outside world in days, and the last few attempts to contact colleagues had gone unanswered. The isolation was suffocating. And then, one by one, the team members began to vanish. It started with Sarah, the team's lead historian. She was the first to disappear without warning. Dr. Marks had noticed her acting strangely in the days leading up to her disappearance, but she had chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. Sarah had become withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone, and had been spending more and more time alone at the plantation house, poring over old records and documents. Dr. Marks had assumed she was simply overwhelmed by the scope of the project, but when Sarah didn't show up for breakfast one morning, panic set in. There was no sign of her, no indication of where she had gone or what had happened. Her tent was empty, her belongings untouched, as though she had simply vanished into thin air. The search for Sarah turned up nothing. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, and no clues as to where she might have gone. The land seemed to have swallowed her whole. Soon after Sarah's disappearance, the rest of the team began to fragment. One by one, they retreated from the excavation, unable to handle the mounting pressure. Some left in the middle of the night, abandoning their tents and equipment without explanation. Others simply disappeared, as if they had walked into the woods and were never seen again. Dr. Marks felt the weight of their absence acutely, each disappearance leaving a hollow ache in her chest. It wasn't just the loss of colleagues, it was the loss of herself. The longer she stayed at the plantation, the more she felt as though she was losing her grip on reality, as though she was slipping further away from the world she had known. And yet, despite everything, she could not bring herself to leave. The land had a hold on her, just as it had on the others. The fear, the isolation, the strange energy that seemed to emanate from the soil, it all conspired to keep her there, to bind her to the plantation in a way that was impossible to explain. But even as the team disintegrated and the plantation seemed to consume them, Dr. Marks held on to the belief that she had to finish what she had started. She couldn't explain it, but there was something deep within her that told her the truth was buried there, in the soil, in the walls of the house, in the remnants of the land's haunted past. Whatever had happened to the others, whatever force had drawn them into the plantation's grip, she couldn't leave until she uncovered it. The mystery wasn't just about history, it was about survival, about understanding why the land demanded this price for its secrets. It was only when she found herself standing alone, with no team, no support, and no answers, that she realized just how deep the hole had become. The plantation wasn't just a site of history. It was a void, a place where time itself had unraveled, and she was trapped within it, unable to escape. The plantation, now devoid of its inhabitants and the archaeologists who had come so eager to uncover its mysteries, stood silent. Time had once again reclaimed the land, folding over the abandoned structures, the remnants of human occupation lost to decay. What had started as a hopeful exploration into the shadows of history had ended in abandonment, with few left to tell the tale of what truly transpired. The air was thick with the remnants of fear, a spectral echo that clung to the place, as though the land itself had absorbed the terror of those who had dared disturb it. Dr. Marks was the last one left. Her colleagues had vanished without a trace, leaving no explanation or sign of where they had gone. What had happened to them? Were they still out there, lost in the woods, wandering in the very same endless labyrinth of dread that had claimed the plantation's past? Or had something darker happened? A final, irrevocable act of force from the land itself, designed to keep its secrets hidden forever. Dr. Marks could not be sure, but the knowledge that she remained the sole witness to the events of the past months weighed heavily on her mind. When the authorities arrived weeks later, after receiving reports from the townspeople about the team's prolonged absence, there was nothing left to find. The tents were abandoned, the excavation sites abandoned. There were no clues, no signs of struggle, no bodies. The officers combed through the site with quiet curiosity, but as the days stretched on and their efforts turned up only dust and silence, they began to lose interest. Dr. Marks had already vanished. It was as though the land had taken her too, or perhaps she had simply dissolved into the mystery of the place. In the end, the authorities wrote off the entire incident as an unfortunate series of unexplained events, a tragedy to be quietly buried beneath the weight of time. There were no answers, no explanations that could satisfy anyone, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part of it all. The truth would remain locked within the earth, bound by the land's refusal to yield its darkest secrets. The story of the plantation, however, did not vanish entirely from the collective consciousness. Rumors began to swirl in the nearby town, fueled by the whispers of those who had lived there long enough to remember the horrors that had once taken place. The history of the Montgomery family, their cruelty, their ownership of human lives, and the alleged practices of dark rites and rituals, remained etched in the minds of the town's elders. But with the excavation's failure, the legacy of the plantation seemed to fade into something darker, a myth too dangerous to discuss, too potent to confront. The town avoided the subject altogether, and any lingering curiosity was silenced by the somber realization that some places were better left undisturbed. But the truth never stays buried forever, and some questions still haunted the region long after the project had ended. Local folklore began to flourish once more, twisting and changing the facts of the plantation's history into something more enigmatic, more terrifying. Stories of shadowy figures seen on moonlit nights, of strange noises coming from the overgrown land, became more prevalent. The house, long since abandoned, was said to be haunted, not by ghosts of the past, but by something far older, something that had lain dormant for centuries, only to be awakened by the unwelcome presence of archaeologists. The stories grew darker over time. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the restless spirits of the enslaved people who had died there, bound by forces that could not be undone, trapped in a place where justice had never been served. The house itself was believed to be cursed, a place where the very walls absorbed the sins of those who had lived within them. Some claimed that the plantation had been built atop an ancient burial ground, that the Montgomery family had disturbed something far older and far more dangerous than they had realized. Whether these stories had any basis in fact, or whether they were simply a way for the townspeople to make sense of the dark legacy of the place, no one could say. But the stories persisted, passed from generation to generation, woven into the fabric of the town's history. For those who had been involved in the excavation, their lives continued, but the marks left by the plantation's grip never truly faded. Dr. Marks, though missing and presumed lost, remained a subject of quiet discussion. Some believed she had simply lost her way, that the pressures of the project had overwhelmed her and driven her into madness. Others, especially among the more superstitious townspeople, whispered that she had been claimed by the land, taken by the very forces she had sought to uncover. But for those who knew her well, the thought of her disappearing without a trace seemed too unnatural, even for someone who had dedicated her life to unraveling the mysteries of the past. They clung to the hope that she had simply retreated, that she had chosen to disappear, to live in anonymity far away from the place that had consumed so much of her energy and spirit. But despite the passing of years, there were those who never let go of the idea that the excavation was not just an academic failure, but a warning. Those who had once been involved in the project, the researchers, the historians, the archaeologists, quietly distanced themselves from the memory of it. They moved on to other projects, other places, but the specter of the plantation lingered in their thoughts. The artifacts that had been discovered, though catalogued and studied, held no easy answers. They sat in museums, in boxes and cabinets, labeled with dates and names, but they remained silent. As if they too were afraid to speak the truth. Years later, the memory of the plantation began to fade, relegated to the fringes of forgotten history. The town prospered, and the land that had once been stained by its dark past was eventually reclaimed by nature. The overgrown vines, the broken structures, and the long-forgotten graves were slowly erased, swallowed by the relentless passage of time. The excavation was eventually regarded as an ill-fated venture, a footnote in the town's long and complex history. Those who still remembered the project did so with a mixture of regret and fear, unsure of what had truly happened but certain that it was a chapter best left closed. Yet, as with all histories, the story of the plantation would never be fully erased. It would continue to haunt the town, in the dreams of the people who had lived there, in the nightmares of those who had sought to uncover its secrets. The land itself, with all its scars and shadows, would remain a reminder that some mysteries should never be disturbed, and that some places are not meant to be unearthed. For now, the plantation is silent once more, but the questions remain, lingering like a shadow at the edge of memory, waiting to be remembered.